Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. And folks, recent attempts to do new, fun and or weird things hasn't really been panning out. And so we're doing something a lot more familiar today with just a pinch of new. So before we go any further, remember to leave a like if you enjoyed today's video and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Also remember to turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. So before we begin, you should know that today's game is actually playable. That's right, supporting me on Patreon will get you access to a playable version of today's project, along with a bunch of previously released downloads and even more exclusive content. And you'll also get early access to the weekly Dev Diary videos before they're released on YouTube. Now today we are working on yet another top-down roguelike action game. So as done before, the player can move freely in any direction and fire their weapon with left click. Well, that's only half true. The player can fire their shotgun with left click, which will create a 3-bullet spread, but their default weapon, the bow and arrow, requires a bit more effort. The bow must be held with left click to charge the shot. That charge is kept track of via a little bar above the player. Now depending on when the player releases that charge will determine how far their arrow flies and how much damage it'll do to the enemy. Also, arrows fired can be picked up afterwards to be used again, technically giving the player infinite ammo compared to the finite shots of the shotgun. And finally, the player can also perform a dodge roll with right click, though it does have a cooldown preventing it from being spammed. In terms of enemies this time around, we've got 4 different types, all with their own behaviors. The first is our standard unit, which will simply move towards the player, hoping to do contact damage. The second enemy is a bouncy little slime that'll only move when it's jumping, which it will always try to do in the direction of the player. The third enemy type is similar to the first, only this enemy will attempt to hurt the player with a short-range laser beam, which admittedly pulsates really weirdly. Anyway, our final enemy is our elite unit, which is basically a beefed up version of the first enemy type. But not only is it a tank, but defeating this walking fridge will spawn a random amount of enemies like some kind of horrible piñata. And defeating these baddies are not only important to the mortality of the player, but each enemy's pockets are full of sticks, and the player wants those sticks. Now, for every 10 enemies defeated, the game will spawn one of those elite units. And defeating an enemy unit will increase the world level. This makes enemies stronger, but also increases the amount of sticks dropped on defeat. And those sticks are important, because fire wants stick, and player must provide. So anytime that the fire is active, the player can engage with the flame by pressing shift when nearby. And this will do many things. First, it will reset the world level back to 1 and restore the player's health and ammo. It will then remove any enemies still on the playing field, basically like a bonfire from Dark Souls. And finally, and most importantly, it will provide the player with a list of upgrades that can be bought using, you guessed it, their sticks. And as one would expect, the cost of each upgrade grows with each level. And the list of upgrades are as follows: move speed, dodge cooldown, bow charge rate, max arrow power, shotgun fire rate, max health, max arrow capacity, and max shotgun capacity. And so the loot may be pretty obvious here. It's basically like the elements of a roguelike distilled down to just the basics. And it gives the player complete control over how they fight and how long they fight, which are simply my way of honestly trying to learn how to approach game balance and progression. Now up until this point, things haven't really been anything too crazy. I mean, we've created games with these features, in some form at least, in previous projects, including when it comes to games with an abundance of enemies. Just for example, all of the Vampire Survivor clones that we've made. And so there's always been that annoyance of enemies stacking on top of one another, because it felt like having to do the math for each of those units colliding would eventually tank the game's performance. And in fact, that concern was very much a reality back in the day. And so in doing research for some of these recently failed projects, it somehow got me on the track to figuring out how to fix the stacking issue. And after a bunch of reading and even more failures because I am just terrible at math, I discovered something called flocking. And thanks to this flocking, our enemies now avoid stacking on top of one another. Now, in the most basic of terms, flocking detects collisions between units and pushes them away from one another using math. And admittedly, because I'm still learning how all of this works, it's hard to tell at the moment if there's a better way to implement this in GameMaker outside of using the built-in collision event. But this, while it doesn't seem like much, is a huge game changer. I mean, this means that hordes of enemies are now much more fun to fight because eliminating one doesn't mean another is immediately under it, you know, with potential for another immediately being below that one. And so hopefully this will, fingers crossed, be a viable standard moving forward here on the channel, because it really does open up a lot of new potential. So have you used the flocking algorithm in your own works? Or heck, did you even know that such an algorithm even existed before today? As always, I would love to know what's on your mind, so leave any and all thoughts in the comments. And with that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.